3 decades behind this wheel, and I thought I'd seen every kind of goodbye the human heart could manufacture. I've watched soldiers heading to wars they might not come back from, kids running toward futures their parents would disown them for, and old folks making what they knew would be their final trips to see family who'd stopped calling years ago. But there's something different about a man who tells you he's going home to die. The Greyhound idles outside Amarillo Station at 2:17 a.m., exhaust visible in the October cold, and I'm running through my mental catalog of passengers from Dallas. 23 souls when we left, 22 now that the college girl got off in Fort Worth to catch her connection to Colorado. The usual overnight crowd, shift workers, insomniacs, people whose lives operate on schedules the rest of the world doesn't keep. Most of them are asleep now, heads pressed against windows, dreaming whatever dreams sustain people who travel by bus in the small hours. But not him. Never him. He's been awake the entire 6 hours since Dallas, sitting in seat 14A with a canvas messenger bag in his lap and his eyes fixed on something beyond the windshield. Not the landscape, though God knows there's plenty of nothing to look at between Dallas and Amarillo, but something else. Something internal, private, final. His name is David Chen. I know because I heard him on the phone when we stopped for fuel outside Wichita Falls, talking to someone in that careful voice people use when they're delivering news that can't be softened. "It's David," he'd said. "I'm coming home." Not, "I'll be home soon," or "I'm on my way." Just, "I'm coming home," like it was a statement of fact rather than a promise. David is maybe 55, with silver threading through black hair and the kind of calm that comes from having made peace with something the rest of us are still fighting. He moves deliberately, speaks sparingly, and carries himself like a man who's finished arguing with the universe about fairness. I've been driving long enough to recognize the signs. This isn't someone running toward something. This is someone completing a circle, closing a loop, tying off the loose end of a story that's been unraveling for years. The station in Amarillo squats under fluorescent lights like a tired dog. All concrete angles and institutional paint that was probably beige when it was new, but has faded to the color of giving up. A few people wait inside, nursing vending machine coffee and checking phones that show no new messages, no missed calls, no evidence that anyone, anywhere, is wondering where they are. David stands, shoulders his bag, and moves toward the front of the bus with the measured pace of someone who's thought about this moment for a long time. When he reaches my seat, he stops, and for the first time all night makes direct eye contact. "This is my stop," he says. "Amarillo? Home." He pauses, and something shifts in his expression. Not quite a smile, but not sadness either. Something more complex, more final. "I'm going home to die." The words hang in the recycled air of the bus like smoke from a fire you can't see. Not dramatic, not seeking sympathy or attention. Just a statement of fact delivered with the same tone you'd use to comment on the weather or announce your lunch order. "Sir, But he's already moving past me, down the steps, into the cold October night. I watch through the windshield as he walks across the parking lot, not toward the station, but toward the street beyond, where headlights cut through darkness and the world continues its business of carrying people toward destinations they may or may not survive. He doesn't look back. Men who've made that kind of decision rarely do. I should restart the engine, call out the boarding announcement, get back on schedule. The highway to Oklahoma City stretches ahead, familiar and indifferent, and I've got passengers who need to be somewhere when the sun comes up. But something keeps me in my seat, watching David's figure recede into the Amarillo darkness, carrying whatever weight brought him this far. In 30 years of driving, I've learned to read the language of departure. There's the departure of people running away, quick, nervous, looking over their shoulders like they expect pursuit. There's the departure of people running toward something, eager, impatient, checking watches and calculating distances. And then there's the departure of people who aren't running at all, who've simply arrived where they always knew they were going. David's departure was the third kind. But it was his smile that stayed with me as I finally pulled away from the station. Not the kind of smile you give when you're happy or when you're trying to convince someone else that you're happy. This was something different, peaceful in a way that seemed almost otherworldly, like he'd found the answer to a question that had been eating at him for years. I've seen that smile exactly once before, on the face of my brother Tommy, the day before he died in a VA hospital outside San Antonio. Tommy had been fighting lung cancer for 18 months, getting smaller and grayer with each treatment, each false hope. Each small victory that turned out to be just another way of losing slowly. But that last day, when he finally decided to stop fighting, when he finally accepted what was coming, his face had carried that same peaceful resolution. "I'm tired, Charlie," he'd told me. "I'm just so goddamn tired of being afraid." 24 hours later, he was gone, and I understood that his smile hadn't been about giving up. It had been about finally being at peace with the inevitable. Is that what I'd seen in David's face? The peace that comes from surrendering to something you can't control? Or was it something else, something I didn't have the experience to recognize? The highway rolled on, dark and patient, carrying me toward Oklahoma City and whatever collection of stories would board my bus at the next stop. In the rearview mirror, Amarillo's lights faded to pinpricks, then to memory, then to nothing at all. But David's words echoed in the diesel rumble and road noise. I'm going home to die. Not, I think I'm dying, or I might be dying, or the doctors say I'm dying. No uncertainty, no hope for reprieve, no anger at the unfairness of it all. Just a simple statement of intention, delivered with the calm of someone who'd already fought whatever battles needed fighting and was ready for whatever came next. Mile markers ticked by like a countdown to something I couldn't name. Oklahoma City grew closer with each passing hour, and with it, the routine of arrival, departure, new passengers with new stories, new destinations, new reasons for being on a bus in the middle of the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I just witnessed something significant. Not just a man getting off a bus, but the end of something larger, more important, than I could understand from my driver's seat perspective. Some departures change you, even when you're just the one who facilitated the transportation. Some goodbyes stick with you long after the person saying them has disappeared into whatever darkness awaits us all. And some smiles, the peaceful ones, the ones that seem to know something the rest of us don't, those smiles haunt you in ways that even the saddest stories never do. Because they make you wonder, what would it take for me to smile like that? What would I have to accept? What would I have to surrender? What would I have to understand about my own story before I could face my own ending with that kind of peace? The questions followed me through the night, unanswered and maybe unanswerable, like passengers I'd never quite managed to deliver to their proper destinations. The thing about driving through Texas in the dead of night is that it gives you too much time to think. Mile after empty mile of highway, stretching toward a horizon you can't see, punctuated only by the occasional truck stop, or the distant lights of towns that exist primarily as places for other people to be from. Out here, your mind has nowhere to hide from itself. David Chen's peaceful smile followed me past Childress, past Vernon, past every small town obituary written in dim streetlights and closed storefronts. I kept replaying that moment when he'd stopped beside my seat, the way he'd said, I'm going home to die, like he was announcing his lunch plans, calm and matter-of-fact, and somehow deeply, unsettlingly at peace with the whole business. In 30 years of night driving, I've developed a sixth sense for reading passengers. The runners, they fidget, check over their shoulders, count their money obsessively. The grievers, they stare out windows seeing nothing, or they sleep the heavy sleep of exhaustion. The desperate, they make phone calls they immediately regret, write letters they'll never send, practice conversations they'll never have. But David had been none of those things. He'd been settled, like a man who'd finished a very long, very difficult job and was finally ready to clock out for the last time. I thought about my own relationship with endings. 3 marriages, all concluded in lawyers' offices with the division of assets and the careful parsing of blame. 2 decades trying to drink away the memory of things I'd seen in Vietnam, conversations with ghosts that got louder every year until the bottle became the only thing that could quiet them. A son who sends Christmas cards but never calls, a daughter who calls but never visits, grandchildren who know me primarily as the guy who sends birthday checks and drives a bus. When my time comes, and at 68, I'm not pretending it's not coming, will I be able to face it with David's calm? Or will I go out fighting, bitter, full of regret for all the conversations I never had, all the love I was too proud or too scared to express? The radio crackled with dispatcher chatter. Other drivers reporting their positions, their delays, their small victories over mechanical problems and difficult passengers. The familiar sounds of people doing their jobs, moving through the night toward destinations that matter more to other people than to themselves. Unit 47, what's your 20? Coming up on Wichita Falls, dispatch. Running about 20 minutes behind schedule. Copy that. Weather report shows clear skies ahead. Should be smooth sailing to Oklahoma City. Clear skies. As if weather was the only variable that mattered. As if the storms that really affect us are the ones you can see on radar. I thought about David's bag. Canvas, well worn, with a kind of patina that comes from years of use rather than expensive aging. Not luggage for a vacation or a business trip, but the bag of someone who'd been carrying the same essential items for a long time, someone who'd learned to travel light because everything truly important could fit in a space smaller than a briefcase. What do you pack when you're going home to die? What belongs in that final inventory of possessions deemed worthy of the journey? Medications, certainly. Important documents, maybe. Though what documents matter when you're settling accounts with eternity? Photographs, letters? Or maybe just the accumulated evidence of a life lived, compressed into whatever physical form can fit in an overhead compartment. The highway curved slightly, and my headlights swept across a billboard advertising a casino in Oklahoma. Your luck changes here. The irony wasn't lost on me. Most of the people I transport are riding buses precisely because their luck hasn't changed, because they're still dealing with the consequences of choices made years or decades ago, still trying to reach destinations that might offer second chances, or at least different varieties of failure. But David hadn't seemed like someone seeking a change of luck. He'd seemed like someone who'd finally made peace with whatever luck he'd had, good and bad, and was ready to see how the story ended. A truck passed me going the other direction, and for a moment our headlight beams crossed, creating a brief cathedral of light in the darkness before we continued our separate journeys into the Texas night. Two drivers, two routes, two collections of stories and passengers, intersecting for just long enough to acknowledge each other's existence before returning to our respective solitudes. I wondered where that other driver was headed, what stories he was carrying, whether any of his passengers had that same peaceful acceptance I'd seen in David's face. Or maybe that kind of peace is rarer than I think. Maybe most of us go out fighting, angry, desperate for just a little more time to fix what we've broken, to say what we should have said, to become who we were supposed to be before life got in the way. The GPS showed 2 hours and 37 minutes to Oklahoma City. 2.5 hours to wrestle with questions that don't have easy answers, to replay a 5-minute interaction with a man I'll probably never see again, but who somehow managed to shake something loose in my understanding of how stories end. Maybe that's what his smile was about, not resignation or surrender, but recognition. The recognition that comes when you finally see the shape of your own story clearly, when you understand how all the pieces fit together, when you realize that even the painful parts, the mistakes and failures and losses, were necessary components of whatever you were building all along. Listen, if you're still riding with me through this long night, I want you to know something. This job, driving the highways, carrying people between their yesterdays and tomorrows, it teaches you that every passenger is carrying something invisible, something that weighs more than their luggage. Most of the time, we never find out what it is. People get on, people get off, and their stories remain mysteries. But sometimes, if you're paying attention, if you're willing to see beyond the transaction of transportation, you catch a glimpse of something profound. If that kind of glimpse interests you, if you want to keep riding along on these midnight journeys, I'd be grateful for your company. Hit that subscribe button, because I have a feeling this story isn't finished yet. The mile markers counted down like a meditation, each one marking progress toward a destination that would bring new passengers, new stories, new opportunities to witness the small moments when people reveal who they really are beneath whatever masks they wear during daylight hours. But for now, in the darkness between Amarillo and Oklahoma City, there was just me and the highway and the echo of David Chen's words, "I'm going home to die." Not a cry for help, not a plea for sympathy, just a statement of fact delivered with the kind of peace I wasn't sure I'd ever understand. The road stretched ahead, patient and endless, carrying me toward whatever revelations waited in the hours before dawn. 3 days later, I was deadheading back through Amarillo, no passengers, just moving an empty bus to the depot for maintenance, when I saw the newspaper headline at a truck stop, "Local teacher dies at home, family by his side." The photograph below the headline showed David Chen, maybe 10 years younger, standing in front of a classroom with that same peaceful expression I remembered from the bus. The article was brief, the kind of obituary that small-town newspapers write for people who were important to their immediate circles but unknown to the wider world. David Chen, 56, died peacefully at his home in Amarillo on Tuesday evening after a battle with pancreatic cancer. A beloved high school English teacher for over 20 years, Mr. Chen was known for his dedication to his students and his innovative approach to literature education. I stood in the fluorescent glare of the truck stop, reading about a man I'd known for exactly 6 hours, learning the details of a life I'd only glimpsed in its final chapter. The article mentioned that he'd taken early retirement due to his illness, that he'd spent his final months traveling to visit former students across the country, that he died surrounded by family who'd gathered from as far away as California. But what stopped me cold was the final paragraph. In lieu of flowers, the family asks that donations be made to the David Chen Education Fund, established to provide college scholarships for students who show promise but lack the financial means to pursue higher education. David always believed that everyone deserved a second chance at their dreams, said his sister, Maria Chen Williams. Dreams, second chances. The words echoed in my head as I folded the newspaper and walked back to my bus. David hadn't been going home to die in defeat. He'd been going home to die having spent his final healthy months doing something that mattered to him, something that would outlast whatever time cancer was going to steal. But there was more to the story. There had to be. You don't develop that kind of peace overnight, and you don't smile that particular smile unless you've resolved something that's been eating at you for a long time. I found myself driving past the address listed in the obituary, 1247 Elm Street, a modest ranch house with a well-tended garden and a for sale sign in the front yard. 2 cars were parked in the driveway, and I could see people moving around inside, the careful choreography of a family sorting through the physical remains of someone's life. I should have kept driving. I should have minded my own business, delivered my empty bus to the depot, and let David Chen's story remain exactly what it had been, a brief encounter with a passenger who'd made an impression. But something about his peaceful smile, something about the way he'd carried himself in those final hours, made me pull over and walk up to the front door. A woman in her 50s answered my knock, eyes red-rimmed but composed. She had David's bone structure, his calm presence. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said. "I'm Charlie Martinez. I was David's bus driver from Dallas to Amarillo on Tuesday night. I just saw the obituary, and I wanted to pay my respects." Her expression softened. "You're the bus driver. David mentioned you. Please, come in." The house was full of people sorting through boxes, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to throw away. The universal ritual of dismantling a life, reducing 70-some years of accumulation to a few meaningful artifacts and a lot of difficult decisions. "I'm Maria," the woman said. "David's sister. He called me from the bus station, said he'd had an interesting conversation with his driver. Said you seemed like someone who paid attention." She led me to the kitchen, where coffee was brewing and photo albums were stacked on the table. "We found something," she said. "Something David left specifically for you, with instructions that if the bus driver from his final trip ever came by, we should give it to him." She handed me an envelope with my name written on it in careful handwriting. Inside was a letter, 2 pages long, and a smaller envelope marked, "Open only if you want to know." The letter began simply, "Charlie, if you're reading this, it means my peaceful smile bothered you enough to come looking for answers. I hoped it might." I sat down at the kitchen table, surrounded by the careful chaos of a family processing grief, and read David's final message to a bus driver he'd known for 6 hours. "You're probably wondering why I was so calm about dying, why I could smile when I told you I was going home to die. The truth is, I wasn't always peaceful about it. For months after the diagnosis, I was angry, bitter, full of regret for all the things I'd never get to do, all the time I was going to lose. But then I remembered something I used to tell my students when they were struggling with difficult literature. Sometimes the most important part of a story isn't what happens, it's how the protagonist responds to what happens. The meaning isn't in the events, it's in the character's choice about how to face those events. I realized I had a choice about how to spend whatever time I had left. I could spend it being angry about the time I was losing, or I could spend it doing something that would matter after I was gone. So I took my remaining vacation days, my sick leave, and my early retirement, and I spent 6 months visiting former students. Not to say goodbye, that would have been selfish, making my death about them, but to see what had become of the seeds I'd tried to plant in their minds years ago. To see if the stories I'd taught them about courage and resilience and the power of literature to change lives had taken root in any meaningful way. What I found was extraordinary. Students who'd become teachers themselves, inspired by books we'd read together. Students who'd overcome impossible odds because something we'd discussed in class had given them the courage to keep going. Students who'd found their voices as writers, as leaders, as human beings, because someone had once told them their thoughts mattered. I discovered that my life had meaning beyond my own experience of it, that the work I'd done, the attention I'd paid, the care I'd taken with young minds, all of that had rippled outward in ways I'd never known, creating changes that would outlast my body by decades. That's why I could smile when I told you I was going home to die. Because I wasn't just going home to die. I was going home to complete a life that had already achieved its purpose. I was going home as someone who'd learned that the real measure of a life isn't how long it lasts, but how much it echoes in the lives it touches. The smaller envelope contains the details of why this matters to you specifically. Open it only if you're ready to discover that sometimes the most important passengers are the ones who carry us, not the ones we carry. My hands were shaking as I reached for the smaller envelope. Maria was watching me carefully, like she knew what was inside but wanted to see my reaction. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with a name at the top. Carlos Martinez, Vietnam veteran, struggling student 1987 to 1989. Below that was a photocopy of an old high school transcript showing failing grades in everything except English, where I'd somehow managed to pull B's and even a few A's. And below that, a note in David's handwriting. "You probably don't remember, but you were in my 3rd period English class during your senior year at Amarillo High. You were 19, a veteran trying to finish school on the GI Bill, struggling with everything except the literature discussions. You wrote an essay about driving through Vietnam and supply convoys, about how reading helped you stay sane during the war, about how books were the only thing that felt real when everything else felt like nightmare. That essay changed how I taught literature for the next 30 years. It made me realize that stories aren't just entertainment, they're survival tools, ways of making sense of experiences that don't make sense, ways of finding meaning in chaos. You helped me become the teacher I was meant to be. And now, 35 years later, you helped me die the way I was meant to die, peacefully, knowing that my life had mattered. The circle is complete, Charlie. Thank you for the ride home." I sat in David Chen's kitchen, surrounded by his family, reading about a connection I'd never known existed, understanding finally why his smile had seemed so familiar, so peaceful, so much like something I'd been searching for my entire adult life. 35 years ago, a struggling student had written an essay about finding meaning in books while driving through a war zone. That essay had inspired a teacher to spend 3 decades helping other struggling students find their own meaning, their own survival tools, their own reasons to keep going. And then, In his final days, that same teacher had found his way onto a bus driven by that same struggling student, now grown old and gray and still searching for his own peace, still trying to understand how his own story made sense. The man who'd smiled peacefully about going home to die had been completing a circle I'd never known we were drawing together. Maria refilled my coffee cup with the steady hands of someone who'd been taking care of practical details while processing impossible emotions. Around us, the house hummed with the quiet activity of family members sorting through David's possessions. Books being packed for donation, photographs being claimed by relatives, the careful archaeology of a completed life. "He talked about you," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Not just from the bus ride, but from years ago. He kept that essay you wrote, used it in his teacher training workshops as an example of how literature can be a lifeline for struggling students." I stared at the photocopy of my own handwriting from 35 years ago, the careful script of a 19-year-old veteran trying to explain how books had kept him sane in a war zone. I barely remembered writing it, barely remembered being that young man who thought high school English was his biggest challenge. "I don't understand," I said. "How did he know I was his bus driver? I never told him my name." Maria smiled, and for the first time since I'd arrived, it wasn't a grief-shadowed expression. "He recognized your voice. Said it was the same voice that used to ask questions about Hemingway and Steinbeck, the same voice that defended Holden Caulfield when the other students said he was whiny and privileged." The memory came back slowly, like developing film in a dark room. Mr. Chen's classroom, afternoon light streaming through tall windows, the smell of chalk dust and teenager anxiety. I'd been the oldest student in every class, the guy with combat boots and a 1,000-yard stare who somehow found himself debating the meaning of the old man and the sea with kids who'd never been more than 50 miles from Amarillo. He said you were the student who taught him that teaching wasn't about curriculum, it was about connection, about finding what mattered to each individual kid and using that as a bridge to everything else they needed to learn. I thought about my own decades of driving, the thousands of passengers I'd carried, the stories I'd collected and protected and sometimes forgotten. Had any of them recognized me years later? Had any of them carried something I'd given them, a moment of kindness, a willingness to listen, a safe passage through their own dark nights, into their future lives? "Maria, can I ask you something?" David said in his letter that he spent his final months visiting former students. What was he looking for? She was quiet for a moment, looking through the kitchen window at the garden David had tended until he became too weak to hold tools. "Proof," she said finally. Proof that his life had mattered beyond his own experience of it. Proof that the attention he'd paid, the care he'd taken with young minds, had rippled outward in ways that would outlast him. And did he find it? Oh, yes. He found teachers who'd been inspired by his classes to pursue education. He found writers who said his encouragement had given them the courage to keep going when rejection letters piled up. He found people who'd overcome addiction, poverty, abuse. People who said something he'd taught them about resilience in literature had helped them find resilience in life. Maria reached across the table and touched my hand. "But you were special, Charlie. You were the full circle. The student who'd helped him understand his purpose, who'd shown up 35 years later to carry him home when his purpose was complete." The weight of it settled around me like a coat I'd never asked for, but somehow fit perfectly. All those years of driving, all those passengers carried safely from one place to another, all those small interactions I'd thought were meaningless, maybe they'd been building toward something larger, something I'd been too close to see. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. "What David did," she said simply. "Figure out how to turn it into something that matters to someone else." A young man appeared in the kitchen doorway, David's nephew, judging by the family resemblance. "Aunt Maria, we found something else. In his desk. It's marked for the bus driver, too." He handed me a manila folder thick with papers. Inside were copies of essays, letters, newspaper clippings, dozens of them spanning 3 decades. All from former students, all describing how something they'd learned in David Chen's English classes had changed their lives in some fundamental way. But at the bottom of the folder was something else, a business plan, handwritten in David's careful script, titled "Second Chances, a mobile library and literacy program for underserved communities." The plan was detailed, practical, ambitious. A converted bus that would travel to rural communities, reservation schools, urban areas where libraries were underfunded or non-existent. Staffed by volunteer teachers and retired educators, carrying books and computers and hoped to places where all three were in short supply. At the bottom of the plan, a note. "For Charlie. You spent 30 years carrying people to their destinations. Maybe it's time to carry dreams instead." I looked up at Maria, who was watching my face with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this moment since I'd knocked on her door. "David left money," she said. "No, not a fortune, but enough to get something like this started. His life insurance, his retirement savings, everything. He was never married, never had children of his own. He said his students were his legacy, but he wanted to make sure the legacy kept growing after he was gone. He wanted me to do this. He wanted to give you the opportunity to do it, but only if it felt right to you. Only if you were ready to turn your experience into something that could help other people find their own second chances. I thought about David's peaceful smile, the calm acceptance I'd seen in his face as he prepared to die. I thought about my own approaching twilight, the years I had left, the choice between spending them in regret for what I'd never done or in purpose for what I still could do. "There's one more thing," Maria said. She handed me a set of keys. David's truck. He said if you decided to move forward with this, you'd need reliable transportation to get the project started. The keys were warm from her hand, solid and real and full of possibility. Outside, David's garden bloomed with flowers he'd planted, knowing he wouldn't see them bloom. Inside, his family sorted through the artifacts of a life well lived, a purpose well served, a circle completed. I had a choice to make. I could return to my bus route, finish out my driving career, retire to a small apartment in the quiet desperation of unused time. Or I could take these keys, take this folder of dreams and business plans and proof that teaching matters, and spend whatever years I had left turning my experience into something that could outlast me. The choice felt enormous and simple at the same time, just like David's decision to smile peacefully when he told me he was going home to die. Because he hadn't been going home to die at all. He'd been going home to pass something on, to complete a transfer of purpose from one life to another, to make sure that the work he'd started would continue after he was gone. I pocketed the keys and picked up the folder. "When do we start?" I asked. 6 months later, I'm standing in the parking lot of Roosevelt Elementary School in the Navajo Nation, watching third graders pour out of a converted bus that used to carry passengers between cities, and now carries books between dreams. The Second Chances mobile library is painted on the side in bright blue letters and underneath in smaller text, in memory of David Chen, who taught us that stories save lives. Boss, the bus, my bus now, is outfitted with shelves of books, laptops loaded with educational software, comfortable reading chairs, and a small desk where volunteers help kids with homework or college applications, or just finding the right story to get them through whatever they're facing at home. Today's volunteer is Sarah Martinez. No relation, just a retired teacher from Flagstaff who heard about the program and decided her golden years needed more purpose. She's setting up the computer station while I organize the new arrivals. A shipment of graphic novels donated by a publisher in Phoenix, science books contributed by a retired engineer who read about us in the newspaper, and a box of poetry collections sent by a former student of David's, who's now a librarian in Seattle. Every month, the donations grow. Teachers cleaning out their personal libraries, families contributing books their children have outgrown, bookstores sending unsold inventory instead of pulping it. But more than that, people are contributing time. Retired educators, college students earning service credits, community members who remember what it felt like to need help and not know where to find it. The program has expanded beyond what David's business plan envisioned. We now have 3 buses running different routes across Arizona and New Mexico, staffed by volunteers who understand that literacy isn't just about reading. It's about possibility, about seeing beyond whatever circumstances currently define your world. I'm not the same man who drove that late-night route from Dallas to Amarillo, 68 years old, who officially retired from Greyhound, but working harder and sleeping better than I have in decades. My son calls now, wants to bring his kids to see what Grandpa is doing with his time. My daughter visited last month, spent a week riding along on the mobile library route, said she finally understood why I'd always seemed more comfortable with strangers than with family. "You're good at carrying people," she told me. "You always were. You just needed to figure out how to carry them towards something better instead of just away from something worse." The echo of David's influence ripples outward in ways I'm still discovering. Last month, I got a letter from a high school student in Gallup who checked out The Old Man and the Sea from our mobile library and wanted to thank us for helping her understand why her grandfather's stories about surviving hard times were actually literature. This week, a community college in Flagstaff asked if we could partner with them to bring GED classes to remote areas. But the most profound echo came 3 weeks ago, when I was restocking shelves and found a note tucked inside a returned copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The handwriting was careful, young. "Thank you for bringing books to our school. My mom says reading is a waste of time because it won't help me get a job, but I think maybe it will help me get a life. Please keep coming back." I kept that note, added it to the folder of letters and essays and proof that David had started collecting 30 years ago. Evidence that stories matter, that attention paid to young minds creates ripples that travel farther than we can track, that purpose can be passed from one life to another like a relay race where the finish line keeps moving forward. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving the mobile library back to its base in Amarillo, I think about that moment when David told me he was going home to die. I understand now that he wasn't making an announcement. He was making a transfer, passing something essential from his life to mine, trusting that I'd recognize the gift when I was ready to receive it. His peaceful smile hadn't been about accepting death. It had been about accepting completion, the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your purpose has been fulfilled and will continue after you're gone. I'm starting to understand what that kind of peace might feel like. The kids are settling into the bus now, Sarah helping them log into computers while I organize reading circles by age and interest. A 10-year-old Navajo girl picks up a biography of Wilma Mankiller. Twin brothers argue over who gets to read the latest Diary of a Wimpy Kid book. A shy 8th grader gravitates toward the poetry section, where Maya Angelou and Langston Hughes wait to offer their particular forms of courage. This is what David knew, what he spent 30 years proving, that books aren't just entertainment or even education. They're tools for surviving whatever life throws at you, maps for navigating emotional territory that doesn't appear on GPS, proof that other people have faced darkness and found ways to create light. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, your work outlasts your life. Sometimes the seeds you plant in young minds grow into forests that shelter future generations. Sometimes the stories you help people discover become the stories that help them discover themselves. The bus is full now, quiet except for the sound of pages turning and keyboards clicking and the occasional whispered conversation between kids sharing discoveries. Outside, the New Mexico landscape stretches toward distant mesas, beautiful and harsh and full of hidden possibilities. I check my watch. 2 more hours here, then a 3-hour drive to our next stop, then home to Amarillo, where David's house still has my name on the deed, and his garden still blooms with flowers that prove life finds ways to continue even after the gardener is gone. 68 years old, and I finally understand what David's peaceful smile was about. It wasn't resignation or surrender, it was recognition. The recognition that comes when you realize your life has been building toward something larger than yourself, something that will echo long after your voice goes silent. The road ahead is still long, still full of destinations I haven't reached yet. But for the first time in my adult life, I'm not just driving toward something. I'm carrying something forward, ensuring that the work continues, the stories spread, the possibilities multiply. David Chen went home to die peacefully because he knew his purpose would survive him. Now I understand that mine will too. Thank you for riding along on this journey. Every comment you leave, every story you share about books that changed your life or teachers who saw something in you that you didn't know was there, those are lights along the roadside, reminding me that we're not alone in this work of carrying dreams forward. If you want to see where these roads lead next, hit that subscribe button. The mobile library is always looking for passengers who understand that sometimes the most important destinations are the ones we create for other people.